Psychological horror is one of my favorite genres in film. Out of what can be considered to be valid from hundreds of subgenres, this is one that has grown and evolved exponentially since the 60s. So, let's take a look at it. The horror genre is one that I find to be incredibly difficult to put faith in, but one that I have followed since my young days as a teen. I've always found it to be the most interesting and disappointing at the same time, and if you take a look at any other genre and what movies have dominated the mainstream, it's pretty consistent. And the horror genre is anything but that. You could see, with horror it seems like things have kinda come full circle in a way. In the 60s and 70s, the mainstream horror genre was being dominated with psychological horror that presented itself in a true narrative fashion. With films like The Stepford Wives and Rosemary's Baby and Suspiria, it's easy to see that audiences were able to recognize abstract ideas as horror. Names like Jason Voorhees and Michael Myers were yet to be in the forefront, as we had only begun to receive the sequels that would spawn into their respective franchises. Also, who the fuck let them make 11 Friday the 13th movies? Now, I understand that horror is subjective, and what scares one person may not scare the other, which is where The Shining comes in. At the time of its release, The Shining was one of the most polarizing mainstream horror films to ever come into existence. One of the most commonly shared opinions people had of this film was that it was too slow-paced and boring. Now, over 40 years later, it's claimed its title as one of the greatest horror films of all time, gaining a cult following and earning over $46 million at the worldwide box office. Since the release of The Shining, horror has taken quite a few different approaches. While The Shining was released in 1980, this may have put an end to psych horror for a bit, because in case you didn't know, we got a shit ton of different slasher franchises in this era. So, let's count them down. We got 11 Friday the 13th movies and 1 remake, which was awful. We got 7 Nightmare on Elm Street movies and 1 remake, which was also awful. And then we got 8 Halloween movies and 2 remakes, but then we acted like 7 of them, no wait, 9 of them, yeah, 9. It's like 9 of them didn't exist, and then we got 2 more. There's actually a lot more than these, but you get the point. The 80s and 90s were a time for franchises, and while there was some great horror movies released in this time, I think it's easy to say that this was an era that felt like horror was sort of being reestablished in a sense. That's not to say that there wasn't any psychological horror films being released at this time, they just weren't really the focus. And unless you had made a name for yourself like Stanley Kubrick, you probably weren't gonna make some insane big budget psychological work of art. And while there was a couple of great psych horror movies during this time, they still weren't at their peak, even if one of them did go on to win Best Picture in 1991.
And the Oscar goes to The Silence of the Lambs.
There was some great psychological horror in the 2000s, but the cinematic climate at the time didn't necessarily have the access that there is now. I mean, think about how many independent movies are being released now, even outside of the horror genre. If you have some crazy idea for a movie that is an allegory for a biblical monument that'll piss off a lot of Christians, you can do that. And if you also want to make a film that focuses on grief and depression and how they can manifest themselves in different ways, you can also do that. The only reason that this genre has become as big as it is now is because of the cinematic climate we're in. Think about it like this. Unless your name was Stanley Kubrick and you wanted to make a relatively big psych horror movie, it wasn't going to happen unless you had some pretty substantial funding to cover production and distribution costs. But now, almost any filmmaker will tell you to work with what you have, to make your movie and share it how you can. One of the biggest examples that I can think of is the 2018 film Unsane. Steven Soderbergh shot this entire movie on an iPhone and he released it in theaters because he could. The reality is that we're living in a digital age where filmmaking has become more accessible than ever. You don't have to have your name up on a billboard, and you just need a camera, a cast, and a killer story. And I'm pretty sure that's why psychological horror has become so big. Audiences are finally finding movies that challenge them. Movies that can end with the question of what was real and what wasn't. Was it all a dream? Was it an allegory? And that's just kind of the tip of the iceberg. In 2018, Ari Aster released his first theatrical release, Hereditary. Now, anyone you talk to who enjoys this movie will tell you that this movie is probably one of the best and scariest movies you could ever watch. But those that didn't enjoy it might tell you that it's boring. Why is that? Well, I can honestly say that while I think Hereditary is great, I don't think it's for everyone. It's not a scare fest, and it's definitely not the kind of movie that is appealing to the greater majority of audiences, but it's incredibly smart and very well written. A good majority of people actually think this movie is awful, and it doesn't surprise me. Sometimes audiences just want something that can challenge them, something that they can take home with them that will keep them guessing for days, or in my case, rewatching the film over and over again until a specific plot point makes sense. The psych horror genre interests me for a number of reasons, and while it's not the biggest cash grab for Hollywood, there does seem to be a lot of films being made in this realm. They're all fairly small productions in terms of money, but there's a lot being made in today's world, and it's not like there's no big budget psychological horror movies anymore. Most of the time they are just made for fairly cheap, which is where streaming comes in. Now, if you can't tell by this giant collection of physical media that I usually have behind me in my videos, I'm not the biggest fan of streaming, but I will give credit where credit is due, and that is the accessibility that comes with it. You see, I love physical media, and collecting movies has just been something that I started at a very young age, and I don't plan on stopping. But because of streaming, we're getting the chance to see more and more independent films from any genre you can think of. Due to that, I think it's opened a lot of doors and given a lot of opportunities to filmmakers who have a creative vision in the field of horror. That almost always means mass audiences won't like this, but maybe you will. And 9 times out of 10, I do. If it wasn't for streaming and the way the industry has been evolving, I don't know if psychological horror would be in the position that it is in right now. There's so much content, just like everywhere, now that it's impossible to not find a movie as remarkable and creative as The Shining, even if it's not at the same standards. Movies that are too slow-paced and boring may just need to find the right audience, and it seems like they kind of have. Psychological horror may not be the biggest thing right now, but it's everywhere, and with that, we've had the chance to let more and more filmmakers just tell the stories they want to tell. Now, I can ramble on about this subject forever, but I want to hear your thoughts. Do you like psychological horror? What's your favorite movie in that genre? And whatever it may be, I want to hear your thoughts. So, comment below, like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.